Look at this. Doesn't that look exactly like a face? And there's a hand, see?
Someone who's very close to me seems to be in contact with some kind of entity or spirit.
I think she's starting to suspect something. Your wife.
Harrison Ford plays the bad guy. Seriously. First he killed a woman he slept with to avoid a scandal, then he later tried to drown his wife. Indy, no! And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes.
Scooby, Scrappy-Dappy-Doo, Scooby, Scrappy-Dappy-Doo!
Proving it's futile to expect even one camping holiday not to turn into a mystery, this time it's a glowing monster from space that interrupts the gang's leisure time. Despite looking more like a dinosaur than a space alien, the creature employs advanced technology, including a flying saucer it uses to abduct victims for unknown nefarious purposes. This title was inspired by the blockbuster Steven Spielberg film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, released 2 years earlier. This will not be the only reference to popular sci-fi films in this episode. Tessie appeared to be a gold prospector, but she was actually a thief who robbed a nuclear laboratory of $1 billion worth of radioactive metals. As a disguise, she dressed as a radiant space monster, presumably both to hide her identity as well as to frighten away any potential witnesses. She also used a fake flying saucer prop to escape from the police.
We just stopped by on our way from Venus, right guys?
Here's another reference to Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
I bet you wouldn't treat Luke Skywalker this way!
And a reference to Star Wars. This is not the first time a Scooby villain's plot revolved around stealing radioactive materials, as the bad guys were smuggling uranium ore all the way back in the first episode of the new Scooby-Doo movies. Thus, some of the points I'm about to make may sound familiar. In particular, the inherent physical danger of the stolen goods and who would be willing or able to buy them from the thief. In that earlier episode, Crunch and Rhino were stealing unrefined metals that could potentially become radioactive, and the biggest danger they faced while handling the ore was breathing in contaminated dust, which could later result in lung cancer. Here, however, it's explicitly stated that the stolen metals were radioactive, and Tessie even carried a Geiger counter to presumably monitor her exposure. Therefore, what she was stealing could have been extremely dangerous to her health. As for potential buyers, while valuable, nuclear materials are only usable by a very limited number of organizations or governments. While there's no accounting for the actions of unethical companies or billionaires, it's very possible Tessie was a foreign agent stealing radioactive metals either for her own country's nuclear program, or, worse, she was a political extremist seeking to empower a terrorist organization with the ability to create dirty bombs or even a nuclear explosive. We're all sadly familiar with mushroom clouds by now, but dirty bombs are a bit more obscure. In military terms, a dirty bomb would not be classified as a weapon of mass destruction, or WMD, but rather a weapon of mass disruption, or WMD. They really need to work on their naming schemes. A dirty bomb is a conventional explosive device containing dynamite or other volatile material, but instead of, or in addition to traditional shrapnel, the payload also contains radioactive components like dust or pellets. Upon detonation, this will disperse over a wide area, contaminating all it lands on, requiring extensive cleanup and potentially affecting the overall health of an area for generations. We're not told exactly what Tessie stole, apart from that it was described as radioactive metals. Could they be used to make a nuclear device? Possibly, but only if they were specifically enriched to do so, and frankly, not much would be needed. Perhaps as little as a grapefruit-sized ball of uranium. From what is seen in the episode, the villain stole much more than was necessary if that was the goal. However, for making dirty bombs, not only would the stolen material not need to be enriched, the more contaminated metal stolen the better, so as to spread as much radioactive material as far as possible. Tessie stole enough to potentially manufacture quite a few of the WMDs. The second kind, I mean. This may be academic, as the concept of a dirty bomb didn't become widely theorized until the 1990s, and to date, none have been successfully employed by terrorist organizations. However, as seen by the existence of lifelike, nearly autonomous androids, this particular section of the Scooby-Doo universe is clearly decades ahead of its time. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Tessie was working for a terrorist cell with that intention. The fact that she took as much as she did does make that second scenario more plausible than the first, though there was always the possibility that the stolen material was meant for less nefarious purposes. Perhaps whoever Tessie was working for had intentions of building a nuclear power station and needed fuel rods. The reason I feel this is not likely is that any government willing to go through the expense of building such a station would likely easily be able to legally secure the nuclear materials needed to power it. Setting all that aside, this was also a very high-risk theft because the regulation of nuclear materials falls under the supervision of the federal government. Even discounting the embarrassment to the authorities that such a heist would have engendered, the obvious public risk of having such dangerous substances out in the wild would guarantee that the FBI would devote the entirety of its vast resources to secure the entire region where the crime occurred. We may have seen only one local police car at the beginning of the episode, but that's just because Officer Harris was merely the first responder. He would definitely not be the last.
There's nothing like a hike in the country. Is there, Uncle Scooby? Uncle Scooby?
It can't be determined where in the United States this episode takes place, but considering how many Scooby mysteries are set in the West or Northwest, it's likely the nuclear laboratory in question was in that general area. There isn't much more than a dozen in the entire country, and the one closest to a national border is still nearly 200 miles away from it. Tessie would have had a very difficult time getting her radioactive loot safely out of the country without getting caught. Despite the monetary value of the stolen goods, the customer base was so low, it's more than likely Tessie was focused on ideological rewards rather than financial. They were also extremely dangerous to the villain's health, and the odds of arrest were so high that all the Scooby Gang really did in this episode was speed things up for the feds. The fake prospector gets a 1 out of 5 for the design. Space aliens and dinosaurs have already appeared before in the franchise, but like chocolate and peanut butter, the producers show that the two of them can be combined into a delicious new flavor of villainy. Now I want some Reese's. The alien disguise was certainly unique and featured convincing special effects, including glowing, a flying saucer capable of flight, and eerie sound effects.
Oh, wow! Do you see what I see?
Though that last one did sound somewhat familiar. Where have we heard it before? The costume was also frightening enough, including upper and lower fangs, sharp talons, and black, lifeless eyes.
Lifeless eyes. Black eyes like a doll's eyes.
I question the appropriateness of the costume, however, considering the location. Had the setting been in a desert in New Mexico or Nevada, two states known for space alien shenanigans, this disguise would have been suitable. But for a forest location in what was likely the Pacific Northwest, there was a much better option available to Tessie. Admittedly, by the time this episode was produced, the Bigfoot craze of the 1970s was reaching its end, but just because a fad had faded, never stopped Hanna-Barbera from using it. Not only would a Sasquatch costume be less cumbersome to wear, but it would also be easier to stash and not nearly as conspicuous. Don't get me wrong, I love myself some glowing villains, but flashy special effects like what Tessie used was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it would be convincing enough to frighten anyone away from the scene. On the other hand, the glow from the alien costume or flying saucer prop would be seen for miles away on a clear night in the woods, which had the potential to draw curious bystanders like moths to a flame. Not to mention law enforcement looking for missing radioactive material would consider a glowing spot in the woods a very good place to start their search. Sasquatch fans wouldn't have to wait long, however, considering two completely separate Bigfoot-type monsters do appear in the next season.
Hey, how lucky can you get?
Like not very.
That's incredible!
No, Daphne, that show wouldn't come out until the following year. Tessie's alien costume could have had a practical design element to it as well. Similar to how Captain Cutler's dive suit allowed him to safely prowl the depths of the ocean, perhaps this space dinosaur outfit was so big and bulky because it doubled as a radiation suit meant to protect the wearer from the metals being stolen. But that also makes me wonder if the suit was glowing before Tessie committed the robbery.
Our first clue was the glowing handprints in the car, which indicated someone was using phosphorescent paint to give himself an alien look.
What do you mean I was glowing? Ruh-roh. Just because a Bigfoot costume might have made more sense doesn't take away from the fact that the alien disguise was scary, well-designed, reasonably original, and practical, making it the quintessential Scooby villain outfit. The only negative is that one of the special effects could have worked against it considering the location. I'm giving it a 4.5 out of 5. The very first scene in the episode is a misstep by the villain.
Ha ha! Those fools can never stop me now! Or ever!
Why would an alien from space be driving an Earth car? While it's possible that a highly advanced species would consider it child's play to handle a 1970s two-door sedan, put yourself in a similar situation. A horse and buggy may seem primitive for those allowed to use electricity, but how many of us could grab the reins from Barry, Carl, or Graber and safely navigate to the nearest Essen house? We don't even know if the car Tessie was driving was manual or automatic transmission. If the former, it's probably safe to say that even those of us who have been driving for years would struggle operating it. Imagine an alien trying to work out the subtleties of easing off the clutch. Hell, we don't even have to imagine it.
Here are those photos from the nuclear theft.
I've been waiting for these.
Jinkies!
And we left Shaggy and the dogs out there with that?
When has the rest of the gang ever cared about leaving Shaggy and Scooby in danger? They always use the boys as monster bait. Monster bait. Get your minds out of the gutter. Photos from the crime scene showed Tessie was wearing the suit during the robbery. This would have been extremely awkward for the villain, not to mention extraordinarily attention-grabbing. There should have been security at the lab, so how could they have missed a huge glowing space dinosaur lugging heavy drums of radioactive metals to the trunk of their car? Was Tessie actually the one who carried out the heist? Setting aside how impractical it would have been for her to have done the job while wearing the suit, even if her car was heavily modified on the inside to increase space in the trunk, there's no way she could have squeezed more than 2 barrels into the back of it. We saw 7 in the villain's hideout, implying the theft either consisted of several runs or there were others involved in the crime. Not to go all Archer here, but the writers could have learned a thing from Smokey and the Bandit. Just like how Burt Reynolds' Bandit was hired by Big and Little Enos to distract the police while Jerry Reed's Snowman drove a semi-trailer full of illegal beer to Georgia, Tessie could have been hired by the actual nuclear bandits to distract the cops while they looted the laboratory. If that was the case, they screwed up by telling her where they were hiding the loot, seeing as how she led the gang straight to it. This decoy scenario would have made the ostentatiousness of the alien costume and Tessie having worn it during her earlier escape make a lot more sense. I also can't help but wonder how Tessie managed to fit into the car in the first place while wearing that bulky outfit. Between the huge bottom, thick tail, and massive legs and feet, the alien was carrying a lot of junk in the trunk, and there's no way she could have safely used the brake and accelerator, let alone fit behind the wheel. Perhaps the villain had left the lower half of the costume in the back seat, like how when filming driving scenes in RoboCop, Peter Weller was sitting in his underwear because his robo legs and butt wouldn't fit inside the car.
Correlation! It's a flying saucer! No! Tessie! Help! It's got me!
Some time back, one of my viewers, Mr. Jiggles122, suggested a brilliant idea when it comes to using an acronym to categorize a kidnapping in a Scooby episode. While I didn't use their exact suggestion, they do deserve credit for the idea. Going forward, whenever there's an abduction, I'm going to classify it as one or more of the letters on the FRED scale. F for friend of the gang, R for relative of the gang, E for enemy of the gang, and D for Daphne. F, R, and D are self-explanatory, while the E refers to when a villain kidnaps themselves. You might notice that the scale doesn't specify for when Fred, Velma, Shaggy, or Scooby are kidnapped. But let's be real. How often does that happen? This episode features an E-kidnapping, and a particularly dumb one, because not only would an abduction draw the attention of law enforcement, but the disappearance took place in the very same area where Tessie was storing the stolen radioactive metals. It's quite likely that a search party would easily stumble into her hiding spot, barely hidden by two clearly large doors leading to underground storage. At least Tessie found a clever, if somewhat lazy method of staging her disappearance by blinding the witnesses while she presumably hid herself and her mule behind some nearby bushes.
I wonder what this is.
It's probably the source of a tumor you'll discover 10 years from now, Velma. Seriously, the way everyone just casually handles radioactive material in this franchise is amazing.
We've got to get to a phone and report this.
Fred actually wants to let the authorities handle things for a change. Or is he just saying that because he knows they don't have access to a phone right now?
It's okay, Daphne. It's open.
Hello?
Wait a minute. What happened to the window on the door? Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***.
Oh no! The phone's locked! We can't call out!
Believe it or not, you could padlock rotary phones like this back in the day to prevent anyone from dialing out. But if it's any consolation to Fred, he wouldn't have been able to dial 911 on that phone anyway, since it only had 8 finger holes. Perhaps he could ask the jewelry store guard in the Blue Scarab episode to borrow one of the spares on his phone.
I am about to make a close encounter.
Yeah, like it's gonna have to be a close encounter of the chicken kind.
Just in case you missed it, this episode was inspired by the Steven Spielberg movie.
Let us out!
Let us in! Let us in! Let us out! Let us out!
Well, somebody help!
No one can hear you shouting like that in deep space.
It's a stretch, but I'm going to say this was a reference to the tagline from the first Alien film. In space, no one can hear you scream.
Aha! A customer! Right to this away and a welcome! Take my word, you gonna love it!
Wow. It's no Chinese restaurant, but wow. This is still pretty bad.
This space weapon is actually a remote control device used to operate the saucer from the ground.
Not only did Tessie's fake kidnapping result in the gang wanting to summon the authorities, but she dropped a crucial piece of evidence in the form of the remote control device used to control her spaceship prop. Though that does beg the question. If Velma was in possession of the remote control, how did Tessie operate the spaceship prop when it ran away with Shaggy, Scooby, and Scrappy? I guess she had more than one remote.
Yeah, like the flying saucers probably scared them off too. Ouch! That's hot!
While it's one thing for Shaggy to burn his hands on the engine of the crane if it had just been in heavy use, it's not likely for the crane arm itself to get that hot, unless there was some severe issues with the equipment.
What's that, Uncle Scooby?
I don't know.
That's my Geiger counter.
Like, doesn't that have something to do with radioactivity?
Right, you are. And it's coming from inside there.
I debated whether or not to count Tessie letting the gang find her Geiger counter as a mistake. For starters, why would she have had one in the first place? If her cover was a gold prospector, it would have made sense if she had a metal detector, which is not the same as a Geiger counter. While unlikely, I suppose it's possible that anyone searching for gold in the mountains might carry one if they knew there was a possible uranium deposit nearby and they wanted to keep themselves safe. However, from the standpoint of robbing a nuclear laboratory of materials, it makes sense that the villain would have one to make sure whatever containers they were using for transport hadn't broken open or were otherwise leaking radiation. It was just dumb of Tessie to keep it so poorly secured on her mule that it would easily fall off like it did. Though she does deserve credit for improvisation after this blunder by trying to shift the blame to Moss, the crabby cabin owner.
This clock was on the windowsill.
Is that important?
I think so, Daphne. Watch. I thought it was Mr. Moss until we found that clock in his window. It was the clock's radium dial that made it glow in the dark and made the Geiger counter react.
Radium clocks were a thing, but unless you broke them open, the glass over the dial was usually sufficient to protect those nearby from exposure to radiation. However, Tessie's Geiger counter picked up the clock from dozens of feet away, which meant that either the glass was broken, or possibly even missing completely, since we can't actually determine if it had a cover, or the radiation was so intense that whatever barrier may have existed was wildly insufficient. Either way, Moss might want to go in for a cancer screening. In fact, that might be a good idea for everyone here. I also noticed that the time featured on the clock was 2:30 a.m., but it showed almost 3 a.m. earlier in the episode. Then I realized that for supposedly being the same clock, the two shown weren't even close to being identical, as the one Velma held earlier had 2 bells, while the one at the end only had 1. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. Tessie robbed the nuclear laboratory in full costume, despite how cumbersome and conspicuous it was, and she kept dropping important clues everywhere. She also kidnapped herself, which would focus the attention of the authorities in the area where she hid her loot. Nevertheless, she did successfully manage to make off with 7 barrels of radioactive metal directly under the nose of the federal government, and managed to briefly divert suspicion to someone else. She gets a 2.5 out of 5 for the operation. The space alien gets a final due score of 2.7 out of 5.
Of course not, Scrappy.
It's the aliens! Ta-da-da-da-da-da! Puppy power!
Daphne tried to kiss Scrappy here, but couldn't reach him. What a weird moment. If they established that she was always giving him affection that he didn't want, or he was always escaping her grasp, maybe this could have been a running gag. But out of nowhere like this, it's just odd.
Zoinks! It's the attack of the monster head!
Nope, it's the attack of Scrappy-Doo!
I'm sorry, but the groaning sound being made by Scrappy in the alien mask does not sound like a scary groan. I try to keep this channel mostly PG, so I won't go any further than just to say, close your eyes right now and imagine you're listening to a lady having a good time. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Well, I guess we're doing this again. I am the love child of Scrappy-Doo and Carl the Stuntman. Thank you, I am the love child of Scrappy-Doo and Carl the Stuntman. Not Batman's Robin. Thank you, not Batman's Robin. Jaron Dudley. Thank you, Jaron Dudley. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal shout out in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. I would also like to share a couple of photos of supporters wearing my merch. Thank you to Heckla Games, shown here wearing a Carl the Stuntman hoodie. And thank you to Natalie Hartledge, shown here wearing a Carl the Stuntman t-shirt. If you're interested in picking up some clothing or mugs, there's a link to my merch store below. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. While on the way to a Hollywood film premiere, the Mystery Machine takes a wrong turn, which eventually leads the gang to a run-in with an energy-draining ghost haunting a roller disco. The Spectre is determined to put an end to the disco's business, as well as anyone who might try to stop him.
Hollywood at last!
Like it'll be more exciting when we find the Chinese theater. I don't want to miss the premiere of Hair Grease Fever tonight.
I don't often wince watching these old Scooby shows, but a movie called Hair Grease Fever makes my toes curl with Gen X cringe. If the gang had been going to see a sci-fi film, would it have been called Alien Encounters of the Trek Wars Kind?
I know exactly where we are on this map. Take a left right here.
All right, Scrappy, left it in.
This isn't the Chinese theater.
You can't blame Scrappy for this because he said turn left and Fred clearly turned right. Bill Walker was a middle-aged man who rented a house next to the Sparkles roller disco, which also happened to be his landlord. When he learned that his neighbor was planning on expanding and would be tearing down the home he rented, Walker decided his best course of action would be to ruin the disco to save himself from eviction. The villain here is just an old man trying to keep from losing his home, which is a plot we've seen before, but unlike the Sandy Duncan episode where they helped the old man at the end, nobody showed any sympathy to the old man here. In fact, the more thought given to the bad guy's circumstances this time around, the harder it is not to see his side of things.
I'm Bill Walker. Sparkles is my landlord, and I'm keeping an eye on the building for them.
Los Angeles is a city with rent control ordinances. For those who don't know, rent control is when the government protects tenants in certain neighborhoods by keeping landlords from raising their rent unfairly. In areas where housing costs rise rapidly, this helps prevent poorer people from losing their homes upon the end of their lease. This doesn't mean landlords can't increase rent, but usually it limits them to no more than a 5 to 10% increase each year. This only applies to rentals that are currently occupied. Once a tenant in a rent-controlled building moves out, the landlord is usually able to immediately raise the rent to whatever the current market commands. So anyone looking for a place to lease would likely only find properties at their most expensive. If Walker were to leave his current home, he could conceivably see his housing costs double or even triple, unless he left the city or found something in a really bad neighborhood. And looking at all the garbage surrounding his current residence, he's not exactly living in Beverly Hills as it is. Of course, that's if Walker can find a place. Even in my own tiny Midwestern locale, renters have a difficult time securing a place to live, despite there being several large apartment complexes, innumerable multifamily houses, and mom-and-pop owned rental homes. Los Angeles has perpetually had a notorious shortage of affordable housing, even back when this episode aired, meaning Walker could have very easily been facing homelessness should he be evicted. The writers didn't go much into Walker's backstory, so we don't know how old he was or how long he had been living in his home. But that looks like a Model T or similar in his garage. If he kept that vehicle for sentimental reasons because it was a car of his youth, that would put Walker close to or at retirement age of his early to mid-60s. It's conceivable that he had lived in that residence for much of his life, possibly having owned it at some point but lost it to the bank after a run of bad luck. The owners of the roller disco could have bought the property for an eventual expansion of their business and allowed Walker to stay as a renter until they were ready to tear the place down. Walker did have a more modern vehicle in his driveway, which could imply he was merely a hobbyist in his 50s who liked to work on old cars. This would still suggest him having lived in that home for years because the cost of tools and equipment for working on automobiles generally requires a somewhat stable residency and income. I feel it's safe to say that Walker was likely living in that same house for a very long time, undoubtedly even longer than the roller disco was in business, since those really weren't a thing until the mid to late 1970s. Imagine poor old man Walker, living alone in what started as a peaceful neighborhood next to a quiet roller skating rink where local kids would come to spend wholesome Saturday afternoons, gradually be replaced by loud music every night and crowded streets filled with coked-up revelers desperate to hook up while sweating profusely to Donna Summer music. How is Walker's situation really any different from the old man in Up? Especially considering these are the victims here. These Studio 54-looking
You two can look now. Nightmare is only a rock group.
Rock group? They're the hottest group around.
Scooby is just a dog, but Shaggy is a teenager and roughly the same age as the rest of the gang. How did he not know who the band was? Today, that'd be like a teenage girl explaining to another teenage girl who Taylor Swift was while sitting in the auditorium during Love Story. Incidentally, I had to Google Taylor Swift songs because I don't have a goddamn clue about any of her music. I wonder if that's why I'm so sympathetic to Old Man Walker.
Hey, what's happening with the music?
It's shorting out.
On top of the band shell.
I feed on your electricity, and nothing can stop me. You hear? Nothing!
Setting aside sympathy for the villain and focusing solely on the design of the scheme itself, it was at heart the same plot from the Blue Scarab episode featured in my last video. Just as Gruger wanted to ruin the comic book superhero's reputation by staging crimes in real life while dressed as the character, Walker disrupted various Los Angeles events while dressed as the Neon Phantom to ruin the reputation of the roller disco, hoping that the bad publicity would result in a disgruntled public boycotting the location.
So, you're looking for the Neon Phantom, huh? Well, he sure ruined our business. People blame Sparkles for the Phantom, so they're staying away in droves.
The actual connection between the Neon Phantom and Sparkles roller disco was nebulous, but I'll discuss that in my next section. Incidentally, my daughter has a cat named Sparkles. I bet she'd get a kick out of this, if only she watched my videos. While this plan feels overly complex, it's hard to argue that it wasn't effective. A typical villain would have simply hung out at the roller disco to frighten away patrons, but Walker thought outside the box enough to not only find a different way of ruining the target business, but also draw attention away from the location of the roller disco itself, considering he literally lived right next door. However, by spreading out all over the city and attacking locations like the Hollywood Bowl and Grauman's Chinese Theater in the middle of their events, Walker greatly increased the odds of getting caught. Those places have security, and he was lucky to get away. This is a difficult one to score. Technically, Walker acted illegally, but his goal wasn't revenge or to get rich. Rather, he was simply trying to protect his home, which was certainly understandable. The plot itself was also a bit overthought and risky, but not a typical one used by a Scooby villain. I'm giving him a 3.5 out of 5 for the design. One of the things I look for when it comes to scoring a villain outfit is how appropriate or practical it was for the circumstances or location where the crime was taking place.
We're headed for 731 Sundown Boulevard.
According to this guidebook, that's where we'll find Sparkles.
That's the roller disco they said the Neon Phantom haunts.
That was literally the only way the Neon Phantom and the roller disco were connected. That clip I just played. There was no mention of any local legend. Nothing about a disgruntled former employee having gone missing. No hint of a magic curse. Just a quick bit of exposition by Shaggy saying, "That's the roller disco they said the Neon Phantom haunts," despite there not being any previous scene where the gang were told that bit of information. This was such lazy writing. All they needed was someone in the crowd at the Hollywood Bowl to point to the ghost and say something like, "It's the Neon Phantom. He's the ghost of a roller skating legend who died when a mirror ball fell on him during a competition at the old roller rink." Then Velma would ask where the rink was, and they'd tell her it was sold to a couple of guys who reopened it under the name Sparkles. This would not only explain the existence of the Neon Phantom, but also his grudge against the roller disco. Instead, viewers must accept the Neon Phantom was just a thing that existed, because there's no time for establishing the motivation behind a mystery when there's a dancing potato to showcase. As for the costume, it's a bit of a failure at being frightening. While the markings make it appear vaguely reminiscent of a skeleton, it looks more like a cross between a crash test dummy and a member of Blue Man Group. So unless Tobias Funke gives you nightmares, the Neon Phantom isn't exactly Freddy Krueger. That's not to say it's a complete failure as a Scooby villain, since it does feature classic visual special effects like glowing and the ability to mysteriously disappear, as well as classic audio special effects like a constant electronic humming sound and a spooky distorted voice. Though unconvincing, at least this time the writers tried explaining the effects by showing a battery box and a dimmer switch, which could somehow explain how Walker did everything. This episode's villain was not too dissimilar to the 10,000-volt ghost, except that monster, at least, was able to show a sense of menace with its ability to melt metal simply by touch. Whereas at worst, the Neon Phantom would shut off the power in your house, causing your electric clock to reset, which would make you oversleep and be late to work. Also, like the earlier monster, it's questionable how safe this outfit would be for Walker. While at least the Neon Phantom suit didn't have exposed wiring like the 10,000-volt Ghost, this was long before the LED revolution, so it had to have taken a lot of electricity to power that suit for as bright as it was. One short circuit or tear in the insulation could have resulted in a nasty shock, and for a man of advanced age, that's a good catalyst for a fatal heart attack. Then again, Walker was in incredible shape for as old as he was. You don't see a lot of men in their 60s casually scaling down buildings using nothing but a rope. Though not scary or particularly original, and with no actual reason to exist, the Neon Phantom costume is saved by its special effects. It gets an outfit score of 2 out of 5. Overall, Walker didn't do too bad of a job carrying out his plan. In addition to successfully disrupting 2 public events, the rock concert and the movie premiere, he also managed to interrupt a recording session of the Roller Disco's house band.
Hey, the Sparkles rock group is recording a new album tonight. How'd you like to attend an all-night session?
Great!
Yeah, that'd be great.
The gang were in Los Angeles to watch a premiere of a new film. Then they got sidetracked to watch a rock concert. Then they left that to chase a ghost, and now they're forgetting that to watch a different band perform. They have the attention span of a hummingbird with ADHD.
I want to close this disco permanently.
Never. I'll buy out your share first. Just give me a fair price.
Up to this point, Walker's scheme had been so successful that the owners of the roller disco were suggesting dissolving their partnership or closing down permanently. That they were complaining about a drop in business means that there had to have already been other moments when the Neon Phantom made a spectacle of himself before the episode began. Unfortunately for the villain, the Dooniverse conspired against him when the Scooby Gang happened to visit the city. They may have ended up at the rock concert by mistake, but the teenagers were only in Los Angeles to catch the movie premiere, so Walker's plan was doomed from the start.
Puppy powers!
Scooby, come back!
My pen.
This is one of the very few times in the franchise we see the actual license plate numbers of the Mystery Machine. Also, the van magically appeared on the opposite side of the street from where Fred originally parked. Fred and Velma had several clues to work with during their investigation, but I don't feel it's fair to hold the Neon Phantom responsible for most of them.
What do you got there, Scoob?
I don't know.
It's stuck to your hand. Hey! Help! Get it off me!
It wasn't his fault. His skate wheel got stuck in this tar.
The first scene in the episode was the sticky tar Scooby found in 2 separate spots around the roller disco, with one being on a flyer that had been stuck to the bottom of Walker's shoe, and the other in a wad on the rink's dance floor.
And the tar on the dance floor came from his shoe.
Right, Scrappy. He got it from the disco roof, which is how he cleverly got inside.
Here's the thing. Walker wore different shoes when he was dressed as the Neon Phantom. You can clearly see they are not the same. When he accosted the kids in his first appearance, he was wearing slippers, which makes sense as he was in his pajamas at the time. Whereas when he was in his costume, it doesn't even look like he was wearing shoes. You can see the full outline of his feet. It looked for all the world like Walker was wearing a full-body stocking. Even the flyer itself is problematic, because if it was supposed to have been sticky because of the tar, wouldn't there be, tar on it? It's shown from both sides, and there is no tar to be seen. But the biggest issue with the tar clue has to be the supposed location where the Neon Phantom allegedly picked it up. The roof of the roller disco. Sparkles was in a Quonset-style building, meaning the roof was likely made of steel. While tar or tar paper is often employed in the construction of metal roofs, that material is used under the surface, not on top. Walker would not have been able to get tar on his feet from walking on a roof like that. There was one scene where it appeared as though the roof was made of glass, but that's clearly not the same building, because not only was it missing the framed glass windows above the doorway, but it was brightly lit inside when the roller disco was supposed to have been closed for the night. Late 1970s Hanna-Barbera did not give a f***. The second clue found by the gang was the electronics catalog, which so conveniently featured all of the equipment the Neon Phantom would have needed to carry out his scheme.
Look at this, on the backside.
Humo Pun's eel?
Well, I know what an eel is, but what does Yumo puns mean?
This was delivered to Steve by mistake. Look at it.
Yuma Pun's eel?
Look at it this way.
7:33 sundown?
This isn't the first time that a Scooby show used upside-down or backward text to obscure a clue, but at least they made it somewhat clever before by needing to use a mirror to see it. Here it's just the gang holding the address upside down. Shaggy and Daphne are one thing, but this just makes Fred look really dumb. Not to mention that if this was an actual mail piece, there would have been a city and state on it as well, making it that much more obvious what the real address was.
7:33 sundown?
That's where it was supposed to be delivered, right next door to Sparkles.
Which is 7:31 sundown.
This clue too wasn't Walker's fault, as the catalog was erroneously delivered to the wrong location by the post office. I know how the old man must feel. My house shares an identical mailing address with a factory in the next town over, and I've lost a few pizza deliveries over the years from the drivers going there instead. That's why you shouldn't always blindly follow GPS instructions.
Oh, we got here too late.
Maybe not, Daphne, if we can just check out the theater's electrical control panel.
This is a dimmer with a timer hooked to the master circuit.
That timer wasn't hooked up to anything. It's just hanging on the wall.
But why would a neon phantom need an electrical timer?
A better question would be, who in the hell is guarding the movie theater? This was the night of a premiere with a heavy celebrity presence. The place should have been crawling with security. But not only was the Neon Phantom easily able to gain access to shut down the power, Fred, Velma, and Daphne had no problem getting inside and disturbing police evidence. I'm also having difficulty assigning blame to Walker for this one, simply because it would have been so improbable for him to have been there to leave the clue in the first place. But going by what's seen on screen, he did somehow manage to place the timer, so he should be faulted for leaving such obvious evidence behind. It may not have been enough to lead authorities to discover his identity, but it did at least provide evidence that the Neon Phantom wasn't actually a supernatural being.
The neon phantoms drained all the energy from the building.
And got away with it!
Jinkies!
This murder attempt was undoubtedly a mistake on the part of Walker. Up to this point, his crimes had been limited to not much more than misdemeanor vandalism or being a public nuisance. Even if charged with a low-level felony, a decent lawyer would likely be able to negotiate a plea agreement and save the old man any time behind bars. Trying to drop a massive antenna on a group of teenagers is reckless endangerment at the very least, made even worse by the fact there was no reason for him to do so. The gang weren't pursuing him. In fact, they had no idea he was even on the roof at that point. And while ordinarily I might have suggested this was another baffling moment of superhuman strength shown by a costume Scooby villain, look at how dinky that support rod was for the antenna. Even without the Neon Phantom, it was only a matter of time before that thing was going to fall on somebody. Finally, Walker made another very common mistake by a Scooby villain, not having the gang arrested when he had every right to. The only reason he originally encountered the teenagers was because they broke his water spout while trying to break into the roller disco. Once he learned they were investigating the Neon Phantom, Walker should have demanded they leave or simply call the police to come and handle the meddling kids. Even if he was afraid that getting the cops involved might put him on their radar over the rock concert kerfuffle, it might have been worth it to call them anyway. Considering the Neon Phantom was allegedly haunting the roller disco, 4 kids arrested for trying to gain illegal entry to the place would only increase the number of possible suspects.
I'll stand on the low end, and you climb the tree and jump down on the high end.
Okay.
In a way, Scooby kind of deserved for that to happen. As the adult, he's responsible for Scrappy's safety, yet here he was ready to launch his nephew at a monster. Worst uncle ever. Though he should not have tried killing Fred, Velma, and Daphne, Walker was almost completely successful at carrying out his scheme. And most of the mistakes he made felt contrived and the result of sloppy writing more than anything that should be held against the villain. And again, it should be stressed that he only turned to crime to save himself from becoming homeless. He gets a 4 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the Neon Phantom with a final due score of 3.2 out of 5.
Oh, so the whole Neon Phantom scare was to drive us out of business.
So he wouldn't have to lose his house to the roller disco.
Only now he'll have to move anyway.
Right, like to a place with bars on the windows.
And that's my ranking of the villains from the second set of episodes of the first season of Scooby-Doo and Scrappy-Doo, shown here along with the ones from my previous video. Neither villain did that poorly this time around, and I have to say the Neon Phantom was a bit of a surprise for how atypical he was as a bad guy. These episodes were certainly an improvement over the previous one, so here's hoping the series maintains its momentum. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon and my merch store below. But please only join or buy if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members will receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. You know, I can't help but wonder if I'm now on a list somewhere because of all my Googling about nuclear weapons, terrorism, and dirty bombs. If I go missing, that may be why.